This lesson will be taking notes on 5.3, which is all about asexual and sexual reproduction. What's the difference between the two, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each kind of reproduction? Okay, so we'll start out with this video. This is from the Amoeba Sisters, where they will go over the difference between the two.
When I was 6 years old, I went through a phase where I was really into plants. My sister never really went through a plant phase, although to be fair, she was also 2 years old at the time, so she was kind of into everything. I wanted to have a lot of plants where I could water them and take care of them, but my plant caring skills were not so great, so only some plants were safe. A cactus, perhaps. But you get sick of cacti. One day it so happened, my dad brought home a spider plant. And as usual, the way I imagined a spider plant turned out to not exactly be what a spider plant was, but I was also very happy it wasn't a cactus. "Take really good care of this spider plant and it will have little baby plants," my dad said. "Then you can plant the plantlets and they'll grow into new spider plants too. It'll be fun," he said. Now let's just say I think my dad may have underestimated my dedication with this. Spider plants reproduce by making new, identical baby spider plantlets. The baby plants are genetically identical to the parent plant, meaning they contain the same DNA, a clone basically. You can plant the plantlets and ta-da, new spider plant. As a kid, I didn't realize that what I was seeing at the time was asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction requires only one organism and results in offspring that are genetically identical, uniform, no genetic variety. And many times there can be an advantage that this can be efficient and fast, since only one organism is involved. Asexual reproduction also occurs with very simple organisms, like bacteria. These prokaryotes literally split into two in a process known as binary fission. Many single-cell eukaryotic organisms, like many protists, can do this too. Another type of asexual reproduction that starts with B is budding. A very small, amazing animal called the hydra can reproduce by budding. That means they literally just bud an identical offspring right off of themselves. It falls off and grows into a new hydra. So in the spider plant example, this was asexual reproduction. But it's important to realize that not all plants can reproduce asexually. In fact, spider plants themselves can reproduce another way. Spider plants and many other plants can undergo sexual reproduction. In fact, lots of organisms can. Some fungi and some protists, many plants, many animals. Sexual reproduction involves the uniting of gametes, which are reproductive cells, to make a new organism. If you're talking about animals, typically these gametes would be known as a sperm cell from the male organism and an egg cell from the female organism. Gametes typically have half the number of chromosomes as a somatic cell. So in humans, sperm and egg cells each have 23 chromosomes. When they combine, they can produce a new cell, a fertilized egg known as a zygote, which would then have 46 chromosomes. This fertilized egg can continue to divide to make more cells and more cells. Oh look, this fertilized human egg cell is a blastocyst now. Yeah, it'll keep dividing from there. Now, while that was an example of gametes uniting to make a new human, realize that all new organisms that result from sexual reproduction have the potential to be genetically diverse. In sexual reproduction, the offspring are not clones. They receive genetic information from their two different parents. And gametes themselves tend to be different from each other due to independent assortment and crossing over, which both happen when the gametes are made in a process called meiosis. Check out our meiosis video for more about that. So the gametes are different from each other, and they combine to make a unique organism. Now, sexual reproduction can be more time-consuming because it does require two gametes finding each other and uniting. A little more complicated than asexual reproduction when, in many cases, you can just split. So then what is the benefit in sexual reproduction, and why could this even matter? Well, different genes can mean different expressed traits, and different expressed traits could be beneficial in the case of environmental changes. Let's consider these grasshoppers. Let's say the vegetation present changes due to a dry season, and now some colors of grasshoppers have better advantages than others in blending in, which means perhaps better advantages from hiding from predators. Those grasshoppers with the advantage potentially could have higher fitness. But see, that variation is present in the first place because of sexual reproduction. There are definite benefits that come with variety. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so let's start with talking about asexual reproduction. She just gave you a really good overview in that video of the general idea of what asexual reproduction is. It is when one parent, so a single parent, makes one or more offspring that are identical to itself. Okay, so all of the offspring in an asexual reproduction situation are identical to each other and genetically identical to the parent. In the video, she gave you guys a couple of different types of asexual reproduction examples, and we'll talk about some of those. Typically, the offspring will be completely identical to the parent. Sometimes you might see some genetic mutations that might happen as those cells are kind of copying themselves and DNA is replicating. You might see some mistakes happen here and there as those cells are dividing, but typically we'll see 100% identical clones from parent to offspring. The first type of asexual reproduction that we'll talk about here is binary fission. This video here is showing bacteria going through binary fission. This is for super simple single-celled organisms like bacteria that don't even have a nucleus. And this is just where these cells will just simply split in two. So what we're seeing here on this video is just a single bacteria that is splitting, and then those two split, and then those four split, and they continue to divide over and over and over again. This is how bacteria can get everywhere in a very short amount of time because they don't need to go through that long interphase stage and then go through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. They can simply just copy their DNA and split in half, copy the DNA and split in half. That's what binary fission is. Again, the new cells are genetically identical to the parent cell, but one bacteria can reproduce over and over and over again by itself without needing a partner. So this type of asexual reproduction is for prokaryotes, like I said, which is just a type of very simple single-celled organism like a bacteria. The next type of asexual reproduction is called budding. This is for things that will grow like a bud off of themselves. Oftentimes we see this happening in plants, especially like succulents, that kind of plant. But this is where the parent organism will grow an offspring or an offshoot off of themselves, or a bud on its body, and then the bud will continue to grow until it becomes its own organism. Oftentimes the bud will break off and become its own. Sometimes the bud will just split. They'll just continue to split. This video here is showing Hydra, but yeast also reproduce this way as well.
Asexual reproduction in amoeba and yeast. Reproduction is the biological process by which organisms produce new offspring. There are two methods of reproduction: sexual and asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is the mode of reproduction in which the offspring arises from two parents from the opposite sexes. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, is a reproduction in which the offspring arises from a single parent. Binary fission and budding are two common methods of asexual reproduction. In binary fission, two organisms are formed from a single parent. This mode of asexual reproduction is found in unicellular organisms such as amoeba and paramecium. In budding, an offspring develops from an outgrowth or bud on the parent organism. Budding is found in yeast and hydra. Binary fission in amoeba. Materials required: a permanent slide of binary fission in amoeba and a compound microscope. Procedure: take the permanent slide of binary fission in amoeba and place it on the stage of the compound microscope. Adjust the mirror of the microscope carefully until the image you see has the maximum clarity. Focus the slide under the microscope's lens carefully, first under low power and then under high power. Observe the different phases of binary fission in the amoeba through the lens of the compound microscope. Observations: we can observe that the cells of amoeba are irregular in shape. We can observe the process of karyokinesis, where the mother cell of the amoeba elongates initially and the nucleus divides into two. We can also see the process of cytokinesis that occurs after the nucleus has divided into two. Here the cytoplasm in the mother cell divides into two daughter cells. Our observation further shows daughter cells have a nucleus and their own organelles. Budding in yeast. Materials required: a permanent slide of budding in yeast and a compound microscope. Procedure: take the permanent slide of budding in yeast and place it on the stage of the compound microscope. Observe the different phases of budding in yeast through the lens of the compound microscope. Observations: we can observe that cells of the yeast are spherical or oval in shape. First, a small protuberance appears on the body of the parent cell, known as a bud. We can observe these buds in the permanent slide of budding in yeast. We can also observe a chain of buds on the parent yeast cell. We can also see the nucleus of the parent cell that splits into a daughter nucleus and migrates into each outgrowth. The bud detaches from the mother's body by forming a constriction at the base, which can be observed. A yeast cell has a nucleus, vacuole, cytoplasm, and a cell membrane.
Okay, so she gave us some information about binary fission as well, but also about budding. You got to see it in real organisms. Oops. Okay, the next type of asexual reproduction we'll talk about are spores. Spores are a really specialized cell that some plants can produce that are, like I said, they're really specialized because they are made to survive super harsh conditions. So like really dry droughts or harsh winters, things like that. So a lot of plants will reproduce with spores, like some ferns, things like that, some fungi, like mushrooms, sometimes. So this quick video is about ferns and their spores. what those spores look like once they get a little bit more mature. Typically, spores are for plants and fungi that don't flower. If a plant will make a flower, then that is how it will reproduce, generally speaking. And that's a type of sexual reproduction. The next type of asexual reproduction is vegetative reproduction. You can see this happening in a lot of plants. So this is where a new plant will grow from like a cutting of the plant, or from like a part of the stems or leaves or roots. Strawberry plants are really commonly talked about in this type of reproduction. When we talk about runners, runner is like just this top left picture here where it shows this root bud in that video. That is an example of a runner. That's how a lot of strawberry plants can reproduce. What's important to remember about plants is that a lot of plants can reproduce asexually or sexually by combining their genes with another plant through typically pollination. But anytime we're talking about runners or plantlets or a plant that will create tubers like a potato, then we're talking about some kind of a vegetative reproduction.
Buds formed in different plants. Vegetative reproduction. Vegetative propagation is routinely done and is preferred by many plants. Some of the flowering plants propagate by specialized structures. This method of reproduction is asexual reproduction, where there is no involvement of male and female gametes. This method of propagation in plants is called vegetative propagation or vegetative reproduction. A large number of horticultural crops, such as guava, grapes, pomegranate, orange, and citrus, vegetative crops such as potato and sweet potato, and flowering plants like chrysanthemum are produced through vegetative propagation. Advantages of vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation helps to maintain fixed qualities of the parent plant. Vegetative reproduction offers a uniform rootstock for budding or grafting. This rootstock can be selected from a plant that is immune to diseases. Different types of buds in plants. Stems usually grow above the soil and produce buds, leaves, flowers, and fruits. The place where a leaf rises on the stem is the node, and the portion between the two nodes is called an internode. The stem ends in a bud known as the terminal or apical bud. Buds are also present in the axil of leaves, known as axillary buds. Buds which contribute for growth are called vegetative buds, and those that give rise to flowers are known as flower buds. Buds can also arise on the roots or leaves. Nodes. Grass plants have a weak stem. The internodes are long and the nodal portions will have roots and axillary buds. When they are cut at internodes, these buds develop into independent new plants. Eyes of potato. Potato tuber is a modified stem. The shape of these structures is similar to an eye. These are called the eyes of the potato. These eyes are cut from the tuber and germinated in the soil. Leaf buds. In Birophyllum, buds are situated in the depression of leaf margins. The usual position of buds is either at the terminal part of the shoot or in the axil of a leaf. These buds in Birophyllum are known as apophyllous. Root buds. In curry leaf plant and neem, these young plants develop from the buds present on the root. They develop into independent plants.
Okay, so all of those are types of asexual reproduction where you have one parent creating one or more offspring. That's very different from sexual reproduction, where you have two parents that are combining their genes to create an offspring. And that offspring will have a mix of genes, 50-50, from both parents. This can happen in animals. It can also happen in plants. And that's just through, like I mentioned earlier, that's through the process of pollination. Okay, so in sexual reproduction, two parents are going to contribute a gamete or a sex cell to create an offspring so that each offspring will have 50-50 genes from each parent. The process of that happening, the process of those genes combining or those sex cells, those gametes combining, is called fertilization. In most animals, we'll call those gametes sperm and egg. So the sperm and the egg are fused together. And when they're fused together, that's the process of fertilization. The cell that is formed after fertilization is called a zygote. Remember in 5.2, we introduced the terms haploid and diploid. Haploid cells have only one set of those genetic information. Diploid cells have the full set, like two sets of genetic information. So the egg and the sperm are haploid cells, and they will fertilize or fuse together to become a diploid zygote. Okay, that zygote is just the fertilized egg cell. Again, don't forget that last note. The fertilized egg is called a zygote. So what are the advantages of each one of these types of reproduction? First of all, for asexual reproduction, it can go pretty quick overall, especially that binary fission. So these organisms don't need to spend a lot of time in the reproductive process. Second of all, if an organism has good traits, and that means traits that are helpful to them surviving in a specific environment, if an organism has good traits, and it's going to make an exact clone of itself, then it's guaranteed to pass down those good traits to its offspring. So the good traits are guaranteed to get passed down. Third of all, there's no need for a partner, which can be a big relief for these organisms, because if you think about how much time and energy that sexually reproducing organisms spend on finding a partner, this doesn't have to happen with asexual reproducing organisms, whether it's a plant or an animal. Also, every single member of the species can create copies of itself. So every single member of the species can reproduce offspring instead of just the females, like in most sexually reproducing organisms. So this can result in having more offspring. Those are all advantages that will guarantee, or that will help guarantee, the survival of your species. And that's the goal of most species, is for that species to do well, to survive in a specific environment. If an organism, like a specific plant or animal, can reproduce both sexually and asexually, that has its advantages as well. So asexual reproduction can allow plants and fungi to spread very, very quickly. But sexual reproduction in those plants and fungi that can do both can allow them to mix up their genes, which will help them become a little bit more varied in their traits and will allow them to better survive some environmental changes. Sexual reproduction has its advantages as well, even though it takes longer and takes more energy for those organisms to combine their genes, and there's a higher chance of it not being successful. Your offspring have genetic variation, and that is huge. I highlighted that in your notes. I think that's very, very, very important for you to remember. In sexual reproduction, The biggest, most important advantage is that the offspring have genetic variation. If you have genetic variation among a population, that means there's a higher chance that your species will be able to survive an environmental change. If you have an asexually reproducing organism where every single member of that species is a clone, and you have some kind of crazy environmental change, and all of those clones don't have the trait that they need to survive, then all of those clones are going to die and go extinct. In a sexually reproducing organism where you have variety, there's a chance that some members of those species may have the right traits to survive an environmental change. So you will more than likely see that species surviving those environmental changes and passing down those helpful traits to their offspring. So that is the end of the 5.3 notes. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to help you.